The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. I'm your host, Dan Riveros, with my co-host,
David Hendrickson.
Here we are, man. I think we've reached a new level of distance.
I fear that we have reached a new level. Tell everybody how you're feeling. Tell them what's going on.
I'm pretty sure I got the Rona.
Oh no.
I'm not 100% sure. I actually just walked in from getting the test.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. So.
Well, if they call you or text you during this recording, you're going to have to tell everybody if you're positive or not.
Yeah, I'll let you know. You'll be the first to know. Yeah, for sure.
To our listeners, Dan is our younger, healthier guy on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. So we're being a little bit more casual about this because we're convinced he's going to be just fine.
Yeah. If there was anybody to catch it, I would hope it'd be me. You know.
Well, you would be case number one within Giving Company, Dan.
I like it. First is something is still first.
I feel like there's a plaque or a gift card or a reward of some sort.
Right? Just a bunch of canned soup.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who do we got today, David?
Dan, I am super excited. Our listeners, if they actually were part of the I Disciple podcast, which was the predecessor, I might even say, Steve, the catalyst to the Walking Through Samaria podcast, they've actually heard Steve Haas's voice before. Steve is a dear friend of mine. We're going to walk back in history a little bit. But Dan, you know what? We are not going to be able to avoid talking about college athletics on this podcast. I just want to warn you, give you a little bit of a preface before we get started.
I know how happy it makes you, man. Just go for it. Just go for it.
Steve Haas, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast, brother.
Thank you. It is a huge delight to be with you, as always.
Well, our listeners, you may recognize the voice. You may recognize the name. Steve was with World Vision, one of our philanthropy partners, really our main philanthropy partner over the last many, many years at Giving Company. And Steve has walked alongside us and shepherded the relationship and just been a delight to work with professionally and personally. He roped me into some sketchy stuff, which I'm going to have to...
You went willingly. You went willingly.
I'm going to have to tell you all about. So, Dan, if you don't mind, to our listeners, I'm going to read Steve's bio, and then we're going to have a ton of fun over the next 45 minutes or so. So here we go, Steve. These are my words, by the way. Steve Haas is a catalyst. He's a catalyst for change. He's a catalyst for awareness of issues that inflict the poor and the marginalized. He's a catalyst for action, and he's a catalyst for people and for relationships. Steve was most recently the chief catalyst and vice president for church relations at the Christian philanthropy organization World Vision in Federal Way, Washington, where he served for 18 years. Prior to World Vision, Steve was the president of the Trinity Forum, founder and president of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, Extension Ministries Director and Community Groups Director for Willow Creek Community Church, and Associate Pastor at Forest Hills Presbyterian Church. Steve holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Kansas, a master's of divinity from Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California, and conducted postgraduate studies as a parsonage fellow at the University of Edinburgh in Edinburgh, Scotland. He and his wife, Sev, reside in Tacoma, Washington. She's a dear friend of ours as well. Steve, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Hey, thank you. Always with an introduction like that, I can't really wait to hear what I'm going to say. I mean, wow.
Was Forest Hills Press David and Marilyn Chadwick?
That was the guy that hired me and was really a delightful partner in crime for many, many years. Just a great brother.
What a small world. So Dan, I'm going to make you miserable right out of the gate. David is a UNC grad, and his wife Marilyn is a Georgia grad. and she has the same undergraduate degree as my daughter. So go Dogs.
Nice.
How about that?
Dogs
right?
on top.
It's a small world, man.
Yeah.
And it's going to
Great
get
basketball
smaller.
player, by the way. Great basketball player at UNC.
Yeah, exactly. He played ball there. That's right. So, see, Dan, we can never get away from it, brother. We'll talk about soccer one of these days, I promise.
No, I'm an honorary Bulldog, man. I'm all about it.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Yeah,
I love that. That's important. I think Sam Collier or Nate Butler or somebody drugged you into rooting for the Bulldogs.
That's what it was.
So, Steve, before we talk about your manipulation skills with regards to the mother of all relays, which is probably where you and I have spent our most intimate, time, literally elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder. Hey, before we kind of talk about you as a runner, because that's going to be a fun part of the conversation, give us a little bit of a glimpse, because you have been in ministry for a long, long time with unbelievable organizations, right? Forest Hills and Willow Creek and World Vision. How'd you grow up? Talk a little bit about your journey and your walk with Christ before college.
Well, I probably share the largest sense with military families and their own geographic dislocation. My father was a senior executive with IBM. For those of us who grew up in that organization, that business, it's
moved
just
a lot.
I've been moved.
Yeah.
Because it just every 3 years we were in the van heading for another place. So growing up had a huge sense of not only how big our country is, how vast are its people and the way they think.
Oh, yeah.
I was the third of 4 kids, all a year apart, which meant fit in, don't make waves.
Yeah. Wow.
Frankly, I did neither. And my father became a follower of Jesus when I was in junior high. And that was formidable because I watched a man actually warm up. You can actually see it in our family photographs where prior to that date of transformation, when he decided to become a follower of Jesus, we laughingly called him Sammy Sartorial because in all the family photos, he was the only one you didn't see teeth. It was just this kind of smile, but there was never teeth. There wasn't a teethy grin. After this, and I'm not saying that this is, you follow Jesus, you will develop a good smile. I think there are a lot of other reasons why one wants to follow Jesus, but I can tell you in his case, I watched him warm up, and you saw teeth, and you saw this kind of demonstrative life flow that was coming out of him. And that for me was enough so that 6 months later, I decided to also be a Jesus follower, and the rest is history. I mean, very permissive growing up. They loved the fact that I had this view that God was kind of leading, and they just fed that like gas on a fire. Wow.
And where were you living at the time?
Really the place that most of us call home, because again, we were moving all the time, was California. So Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland. I actually grew up in Orinda and high school at Miramonte High School in Orinda.
Yeah. So when did you discover your talent for running?
That was high school. Funny story. The place we lived before was the East Coast, and I saw all these guys from W.T. Woodson High School, which is in Fairfax, Virginia, wearing they would have embronzed on their chest this stitchery that would say football, so-and-so, and it always said cross country. Came to find out later, everybody had to do cross country because it was part of the exercise regimen. But I thought, okay, I think since I'm not really that great at football, baseball, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why I will die in any of those. I bet you I could run, because that just requires some basic rudimentary skill level. So started doing that and actually found out that if you just run hard and run long and keep doing it, you can actually improve. And I know it sounds so simple, but I discovered that pretty quickly and then started really getting into it and became a fairly noted runner in Northern California.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's cool.
Wow.
It was hard. I can tell you that. It was hard.
So did you run at Kansas? You were an athlete at Kansas, right? University of Kansas.
I was recruited as a junior, and suddenly realized there's quite a shift when you go from being the big fish in a small pond, which is the way I would have described my high school experience, to being a small fish in a big pond. Mm-hmm. And I spent, I would say, half my time inside the ice whirlpool just trying to calm down my body, which basically rejected everything that was being thrown at it. And, I think probably the most important thing for me, though, was being surrounded by a very, very powerful group of athletes who were living out their life in Christ.
Yeah.
And they kind of grabbed me. They didn't allow me to just kind of fishtail all over the road, which I saw many of my teammates doing. Just the pressure of top athletics, the pressure of school, the pressure of relationships. But these guys really came alongside and really became side-by-side mentors for me. And so this was an incredibly valuable time, but I don't think I would have had that opportunity had there not been this athletic connection that drew me into this team.
And was Kansas in the Big 12 at the time? I mean, the U.S. athlete who ran for Oklahoma or Nebraska that was big time running.
It was huge running. I mean, it was Big 8 at the time, but the guy
that's right. Yeah.
The guy that actually took me around the university when I was a junior was Jim Ryan.
Oh my gosh.
My lunch was with Gail Sayers. And these are names that are probably important to some of your older listeners. But to me, Jim Ryan as a distance runner, I mean, if you had said you're going to have lunch with God, he would have looked like Jim Ryan. It was formidable for me to have that opportunity. So again, wide-eyed, I went to the place that seemed to be paying attention to me.
That's amazing. Billy Mills was the name I was trying to think of from Running Brave, and I forget it was Big 8 at the time. That's right. That was back when the numbers all worked out appropriately.
Exactly, when we could remember them.
So you're a big time athlete. You're at a big time school. You're blessed to be surrounded by other believers, which I got to imagine, like you said, is going from a smaller environment to a bigger environment. That's got to really cement, your faith or help solidify your faith. Talk to us about the decision to go into full-time ministry, because that's kind of what you've been doing ever since college, right?
Yeah. I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but I am actually not a big fan of that terminology. For me, it has tended over time to just kind of rub me the wrong way. In high school, I got hooked on doing a lot of deeper reading because of a mentor of mine. And one of the guys that I read was this guy, Malcolm Muggeridge, who was later an editor with Punch. He was the guy that most people know because he came out as the journalist that brought Mother Teresa to the International Fore with his book, Something Beautiful for God. He said something in that book that really challenged me. He said, life is always and in all circumstances sacred, or it's intrinsically of no account. Basically meaning that everything that we do is sacred.
Yeah, I agree with that. I
know you do. I know you do. And we've kind of talked around this. Yeah. So to me, the idea of ministry is full-time vocation. We're all doing full-time vocational ministry. It's just that mine happened to be in the nonprofit sector. And I think because of what I saw my dad doing in IBM as an executive, later owning his own company, but very much investing his company, his efforts, his energies, et cetera, in ministry.
Yeah.
And that's the way we termed it at our table. Then to me, I also saw this thing going on within Scripture where it just seemed that God has this undeniable lean toward the poor and this undeniable lean toward those who are broken. Religion that is perfect and faultless is this, to take care of orphans and widows in their distress. If that's true, then for me, it seemed to me, I want to be at the heart of whatever that is. And I want to lean my energies and my gifts and my abilities toward constructing whatever it is God's leading. But it could have been IBM. It could have been Apple. It could have been could have been any number of 1,000 groups of things that I could have done. But I really sensed that my job was to try and figure out where God was leading, follow whatever that prompting was, get really good at following his prompting.
Yeah.
And then just lean into wherever it goes. And because of that, one might say either Steve can't hold a job based on his vitae, or God has this wonderful sense of humor in which he's constantly swinging us and moving us in ways that are going to grow us up in him.
Yeah. Well, you can certainly hold a job because you were at World Vision for 18 years, and I got to walk alongside of you for about 6 of those. And to all of our listeners, what Steve just said, like, he's the real deal. He is true to what he just said, for sure. So, Steve, Dan has heard me talk about this a couple of times, and this is a bit of a side note, because I want our listeners to really understand your perspective of philanthropic work and humanitarian work and Christian work and serving people. But very first time you and I met at World Vision 6 years ago-ish, we discovered that we were at Willow Creek Community Church at the same time. me just as a volunteer, and a volunteer board member at the association, a volunteer around the church, and my wife was on staff as you were on staff. And today, you and I have talked about this in a Hood to Coast from time to time. Like, we don't maybe say that as loudly as we used to. And our audience knows I'm a little bit tongue in cheek when I say that, but you know, the reality is in Christianity, period, not just Willow Creek, there's been this kind of, and Bill was a dear friend of mine, is a dear friend of mine. So, but this trend of treating our pastors like celebrities, and we've seen time and time again that things can get out of control. And you and I think, share one of the things we loved about Willow Creek was how much they were pro-women, preaching women at the pulpit. And, you know, a couple years ago, Willow has a major blow up in the integrity category. Bill resigns, the staff resigns, etc. We're now a little bit removed from that. It was actually not this past Hood to Coast, but I think two before that, where we actually had lots of conversations in the van with the runners and all of that about the Willow Creek thing. How would you put that in perspective? You worked there. You have a passion for those that are not treated well. Can you maybe help us process what happened at Willow, what happened at Hillsong, New York, you know, other places? How do we move on from those things? How do we deal with them and move on?
Yeah, great question. It's funny, I'm asked this a lot. I think it's probably important to point out that Willow, for me, provided one of the most important eras of my own personal ministry. I mean, I had the privilege of working with some of the greatest colleagues, many of which I know are personal friends of yours and Rhonda's.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it was the esprit de corps of the staff, the energy, the sacrifice that individuals were making, not just staff, but volunteers. I mean, you had this very legitimate sense that there was nothing that a committed group of folks who are following after Jesus couldn't do for the sake of the kingdom. And if anything, the biggest issue that we dealt with when I was there was burnout, just emotionally, because people were leveraging so much to see folks come to faith. And often you can confuse kind of how to get your energy or where to get your energy from. And it can be more personal produced, which just ends up, you know, people get eradicated if you're not careful. You're just not feeding enough on the Lord. As for the leadership, as for Bill, as for women who related inappropriate behavior patterns, whether it be the thousands of church members or the the larger church body that relates to the various worldwide ministries that Willow still is producing. I think all of us would agree that the impact has been significant and in fact is still being felt. But I think the thing I keep getting back to is even knowing all that, there is a line that I have to govern. What is my reaction or response, seeking to shed light on, or the healing that I'm trying to approach?
Yeah.
And where is simply my depraved need for lurid detail, feasting on a little bit of tantalizing gossip that puts me kind of in the know, true or not?
Yeah.
And what's worse is then spreading it. And I grew up, one of the things that I did, one of my favorite things still to do is to take the proverb for the day, 31 Proverbs. So, there's probably a proverb out there, chapter, that's got your day written on it. Today would be 21:22. You could just kind of reach in, grab either one of those. And one of those is Proverbs 16:28. A perverse man spreads strife, a slanderer separates intimate friends. And I've been guilty of that too often.
Yeah.
Instead of my, being one that's peaceable, one that's not maligning anyone, one that's gentle, one that shows consideration. So what I've attempted to do, knowing so many of the people involved here, is to begin to pray through the leadership, their families. Man, the families have been impacted because of this. Every one of the families, I see the picture of what happened at Hillsong. I see the picture of his family. Yeah. I guarantee you every child has been impacted by this.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I pray for the members of the church. I pray for the elders that are having to work their way through this. I pray for the worldwide kingdom impact of this as it besmirches possibly someone's view of Jesus. And in that way, I'm not saying I'm perfect because, again, I've stumbled here. I've taken what I thought was I think I'm an authority here, and I've stepped in where I wasn't supposed to step in, and instead I've caused discord and maybe even a wrong view of the kingdom. So for me, it's been critical to ask for justice, to ask for healing, to ask for reconciliation. And to ask for that, and then to ask for my neighbors who are asking questions to go back to your corner.
Yeah.
And to spend time there, because the God who's our witness has seen all this. There is one who knows. And that was the one I'm connected to, and I need to make sure that connection is solid.
That's good.
Yeah, that was really good. That was really good.
Hey, Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second.
Okay.
So I've been, until recently, Rhonda and I are going to start with a new church plant, right? Right from the ground up. So we're beginning that.
Yeah.
Prior to that, Steve, you know this, I've been nothing but a mega church guy since really moving to Chicago. I mean, a little bit of time downtown at a small church in the city, but since moving to Chicago after college, I've been connected to Willow in Chicago, Fellowship in Dallas, North Point and Passion in Atlanta. Dan, from your perspective, when something like this happens in the mega church world, what's the mainstream reaction? Is it like, well, people will be people, or is it that much more hypocritical, right? Because it's a big Christian environment.
I think it comes off as hypocritical, but I think that no one's ever more surprised than the members of the church.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like secular looking in, I don't think it's like, oh, that's not an uncommon story that we've heard,
Good point.
It happens.
Yeah.
And then for people that are not even submerged in that culture every day or every week, once a week, whatever it may be, it's like, it's not the craziest thing.
But I would go, I think sometimes, and the thing that I think challenges me early in my ministry, when you talked about Forest Hill, people who know that church in Charlotte, North Carolina, know that it actually, the property itself sits on the original broadcast property for PTL. And if you can remember that far back to Jim and Tammy Faye Baker and their ministry, I mean, my first office, this is trivia. You'll never be asked this on Trivial Pursuit if you ever play it, but my first office was Jim and Tammy Faye Baker's daughter's room.
Oh, God.
That was my office. It was sweet. Private bathroom, shower.
I bet it was.
Had it all.
I bet
Let me
it
tell
was.
you.
Yeah.
It was great. But one of the abnormalities or ironies, I should say, that came with this job is when I went to hire for an administrative assistant, many of the people that had lost their jobs at PTL came back to the original property seeking work.
Yeah.
And I sat down with a woman who, because of the way in which the questions were being asked, I felt like I could ask. And I just said, did you know about these issues that were going on with Jim Baker? And she said, yes, I did.
Mm.
And I paused, as you would probably pause hearing good admission like that. And I said,
Yeah.
What did you do? And she said her response was, in our organization, it was kind of an unwritten rule that you never speak against the Lord's anointed. By the way, that's not an unwritten rule just for PTL. That's an unwritten rule for so many churches and church leadership structures that I've known.
Mm.
Whereas that's the voice that speaks for God. And so because of that, if I see something that it's not see something, say something, it's see something, hold back, wait a second, that's leadership. And I will just tell you, that's the step toward toxicity within the fellowship. That in fact, in love, the scripture says we're supposed to approach one another.
Yeah.
And it's out of love, if it's out of that heart of love, that we're supposed to bring correction. And unfortunately, in many of these cases, I think there have been staff that were aware. But again, you had this, can't speak against the Lord's anointed, and so therefore we go quiet.
Yeah. It's so wise, Steve. And I think, you know, I've been prompted to ask, and we've been blessed to have you on the show, Danielle Strickland, who spoke at the very first Global Leadership Summit after the blow up on behalf of Men and Women Are Better Together, Alvin Bibbs, who was at Willow in the outreach area, Jimmy Mayato, you know, is a dear friend of mine, dedicated my son. To everybody listening, you know, every time I inquire, there's one thing that's consistent in the response, and that is that there isn't anybody that doesn't believe there's an opportunity for redemption here. And there isn't anybody whose heart doesn't break for the victims and whose heart doesn't break, Dan, to your point, for the congregants, right? All the people that were doing incredible ministry day in, day out, supporting the church. And Willow did, I mean, some unbelievable work. And, you know, that I guess I just find it refreshing, Steve, that no matter who I talk to and what their role was with the church, there's this desire that this can be used for good. You know, can we have healing? Can we have forgiveness? Can we have redemption, et cetera?
And I think also we've got to develop, I don't think this is always there, we need to develop a heart for even the accused. If in fact we are following the one that says pray for our enemies.
That's right. Yep.
My guess is this is also the one that said, you know, I not only want you to pray for all that stuff that you deem good and needs to be reconciled and those who are hurt and lonely, etc., but also I want you to pray for those who you might even see as perpetrators of these acts, or the accused of these acts, or the enemy of you. That is actually the thing that, for me, makes our faith stand out from every other kind of faith, in light of the fact we're not just unto our own or those who just get it right, but that the Lord reached out to me when he saw me at my most sinful, my most broken, he saw me then.
Yeah.
And I think he sees whoever these individuals are that come up in conversation for which, you know, it's very easy to quickly demonize. And again, hear me, I'm not saying let them off, you know, no justice, no. Right. I am saying, though, are we praying for them too? Are we recognizing that inside them is also an image bearer of the King?
Yeah.
And worthy of redemption.
Yeah. Very well said. Very well said. Very well said. Well, Steve, we're going to turn the page a little bit and talk about just some of the amazing work and observations and passions that you've had really serving people around the world. Dan and I, our listeners may know this, went to Ethiopia together with World Vision. Marianne Osborne led us on that trip. Eddie Brown was over there to receive us as the country director of Ethiopia. And Mesrach Ayeli was sort of our donor liaison who walked us around and helped me get clothes in the marketplace when my luggage went to Madagascar and stuff like that. So Dan and I were you and I were sort of the ones who ate the most Ethiopian food, right?
For sure.
Wasn't that sort of our
Fearless.
Yes.
Fearless.
So we were into it, Steve. I have heard you speak with ferocious passion, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. passion about Syrian refugees, about kids in South Sudan, about persecuted Christians in Iraq, about Christians in Palestine. I mean, you have been involved with some of the most intense humanitarian issues over the time that I've known you. So I would say over the last 6 years, but I would assume probably much, much longer than that. With that as a backdrop, we've gone through a very divisive political process in this country today over the last several weeks, as you've mentioned, several months. But your focus, Steve, your heart has always been a global one. We've got challenges in our country. When you look around the world, including the United States, what do you think are the most pressing humanitarian issues facing our planet right now?
All right, it's a great question. The one that probably immediately comes to mind, and Dan, my sympathies for having to deal with COVID, but I think the COVID pandemic from a global perspective has got to be, at least for me right now, the number one top of mind. I mean, when you consider the fact that we're being rather judgmental on how this key vaccines are getting out, the numbers of people being vaccinated, how many arms are being touched, the number of deaths alone has been just stunning to see. And then you realize there are nations that have really no health system to speak of that are dealing with the exact same thing. And in fact, they're dealing with variants they don't even know they have. They're reliant on the compassion of nations like ours to share our success. I heard a stunning fact last night in which someone was recounting one such country that probably will not be looking at vaccinations until 2024, 2025. And there are no respirators. So when I begin to think about that, it's stunning. Because if in fact I do believe that God looks at me in the same way he looks at them, there's not a worth gradient that I'm somehow higher on the scale than they are, then that's a considerable thing to think about. I think about clean water. 1 billion people still drinking unclean water. About 1,000 kids die every day from contaminated water. 200 million hours women are kind of taking that long, lonely walk to find typically unclean water sources to give to their families. Yeah. So that too would be an issue. And by the way, the COVID-19 and the clean water issues collide, because when you start thinking about health and how COVID-19 feeds on fragile systems, unclean water inside a system, basically makes you a recipient of just about every kind of disease that comes at you. Education was another one that came to mind globally. I mean, 66 million little girls are out of school. 66 million.
Wow.
So I could go on. Jobs, micro-lending, empowerment of the poor. The issue for me is we have so burdened ourselves with media. I think you said it, with media, with information that has only made us become more insular.
Yeah.
Where we're kind of,
yeah.
It's all about me. It's all about my world. It's all about my health. It's all about my body. It's all about my family. It's all about my church. It's all about my neighborhood. And yet the one I follow made it his goal and calls me out to look outside myself. So if I'm going to truly be his follower, one of my kind of regular questions is, to what extent is this about you? And to what extent is this about them?
Yeah. Yeah. Aren't we supposed to be them people? I mean, isn't that really at the core of the Christian message? Is, I think Danielle Strickland told us this last week, right, Dan? She said, get out of your heads. Go serve somebody.
Yeah.
Stop yelling at each other. Go serve somebody. We're supposed to be them people. This is a them faith.
It's the largest attractant to our faith. I mean, I came to faith because I saw a change that happened in my dad, in which he became, I think he was already outward focused, but man, I saw this turbocharged. When the Spirit takes on an obedient life, and you actually follow those promptings to do things that you would not typically do in the natural, in the normal, and you do that, I guarantee you there's a following. There's a group of folks who are watching that life and taking notes. And I watched my dad's life, and he had been watching my mom's life over years of doing this.
Wow.
That's how my dad came to faith.
Yeah.
So if we're going to see that thing continue, we've got to put our head and heart on that, where we begin to actually do what he called us to do.
Mm. That's good.
Yeah, that's good.
So COVID, obviously, clean water, obviously. One of the other areas that I've heard you speak passionately about was the Syrian refugee crisis. I think you and Rich Stearns both, I've heard speak about that. How is the world doing? That's a big 7.3 billion person question in the area of conflict, civil war, resettlement, refugees. Give our listeners a sense of your global perspective of conflict.
Well, conflict is obviously probably the greatest creator of refugees. Obviously, you have natural disasters that can create these floods, famines, et cetera. But the granddaddy of them all is conflict. It's man's inhumanity to man and women's inhumanity to each other, and predominantly men. When that happens, you get these people movements, not just people within their own countries having to move away from their own homes, but then crossing borders and the dangers that are inflicted on them because of that. For you and I, so much of our conversation was around the Syrian refugee crisis, and that really has not been solved. You've got a nation still that is the animosity level is so high, the violence level is so high that refugees are unwilling to go back and try and reclaim their lives, and instead perfectly willing to live in a tent for the next number of years. And when I say tent, I'm talking about just a sheet of plastic over a wooden frame in the middle of what I would call inhospitable temperatures, both in the summer and in the winter. Snow in the winter, cascading through your roof because it's made of plastic, and heat, the likes of which keep you unable to really work if you even able to work during the summer. So again, just inhospitable environments in which people are having to live. And again, we get to what extent are we going to move? To what extent are we going to help? A lot of that has to do with information. And over the last number of years, we've had a difficult time hearing about them.
Yeah. Wow. So maybe go deeper on that, on the information. Like, how are the evangelical Christians and the church doing to help that right now? I mean, these are issues that have been and still are. So how does the church mobilize to do more in the areas of compassion and mercy and serving the poor?
I do think a lot of it is staying awake. I I was on an airplane sitting next to a heart surgeon in economy. That one alone still has me somewhat smiling. What are you doing in economy?
Shouldn't heart surgeons be able to upgrade? Like what?
What's the story? You run out of points, you cheapskate. And he had the window seat also, which I found also interesting because I'm always an aisle guy. But
I'm an aisle guy as well. Yeah.
As we talked, I found out he was a believer from Texas, and I said, we got talking about the world situation. That's often what happens when you're with someone from World Vision. And in the midst of that conversation, I threw out a question. I often will do this on an airplane just to keep conversation rolling. I said, okay, you're a heart surgeon. The heart continues to beat. How is it that we as followers of Jesus, if in fact we were told that like our main way of doing real religion is taking care of orphans and widows in their distress, taking care of vulnerable people. Yeah. How do we make that reflexive so that it automatically happens? I mean, what would need to be in place to make that happen? Then he went on this huge discursive on the heart. I mean, it got deep and more information than I ever wanted to know about the heart. It was interesting, but it was a little thick. And then he stopped and he went, you know, for a human heart to beat for the world such that you would engage it, I think, you've got to really know, you've got to really, and he kept stopping and he said, I think you really got to know Jesus.
Yeah.
And you got to really know what Jesus said.
Mm.
And so after he said that, he was quiet. And I didn't realize he had taken a pause. So I interrupted him and I said, well, that would just make you one like theological egghead. I mean, that would just make you, I mean, if I did only that, I think I would be super conceited and just, I think I'd become a Pharisee. I mean, just me, I'm speaking for me, not Dave or Dan. I mean, that's Steve. I think I'd become a Pharisee. He said, it's not enough with that. He said, it's also seeing the world the way it is, not the way you want it to be.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, and I said, would that create the reflexiveness of the heart? So that the heart actually moves immediately to react? He said, yes. If you have those two things, a deep understanding, growing understanding of what Jesus actually said and did, and you're willing to follow it, and if you're actually taking an active view as to the way the world is, not the way you want it to be. I mean, I'm listening. We have a Christian radio station here, and it just tells you the way the world, the way you want it to be.
Yeah.
And it's happy clappy. It's what I would call it early happy clappy, but it does not help me at all understand how to live my Christian faith because I don't feel it's real. But what if I got on a regular basis? I just don't want that. If I have that and I don't have what Jesus was and did as my lead, I will get depressed really quickly. But if I see that as the world the way it really is, as my marching orders, both locally and internationally,
yeah,
and I'm feeding my heart with the way Jesus has asked me to follow him, and he's giving me his spirit, and he's giving me his energy, and he's giving me his peace, then I will find, I think, and this has been true in my life, at least in the ways in which I've tried to discover it and live it out, I find I automatically engage.
Yeah.
I just do.
Yeah. Well, that's in your DNA for sure, for all the time that I've known you. When you think, you know, Dan and I have really been fortunate to have people like you and Kitty Murray and Jim Mayato and Philip Langford from IJM. Dr. Ray Norman has been on here. I mean, these are believers that are making it happen.
That's right.
When you think of Dan's question about the church, I feel like on some days, like the church is getting a bad rap. They're doing really good work in the areas of COVID service and injustice and serving the poor and orphans and widows, et cetera. And then I'm like, no, they're just like the radio station that you mentioned. It's like the happy flappy thing and everything's good. And all you need to do is come sit in the pew. You don't really need to go out and walk across the road and serve people, right? You would know better than I. I mean, you led church relations at World Vision. You've been doing this for a long, long time. The church is sort of an unfair way to ask the question, but where is the church on that paradigm? Are they too like the Christian radio station, or are they doing good work, or where would you put them?
I think right now in our own country, I think we're somewhat flummoxed. We're confused. In many ways, we've tied ourselves into things that are not necessarily Jesus. And we've expected that in some way would provide some level of satisfaction or some level of salvation. It would actually get us through, get us to what we want or what we need, what we think is right.
Yeah.
But I think anytime we do that, we have what C.S. Lewis so often called Christianity and in the great book, The Screwtape Letters. And that is excuse your listeners, I'm going to use a word that I think you'll understand my utilization of it. It's a bastard.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is not true. It is not right. And if we hold it too closely, we will find we have to protect it. And anytime we have to protect anything that we think is God's, I think we got a problem, because God's a big God. God can protect himself. Our job is simply to follow him and to wage peace, not with war, but to wage peace in the peaceful means in which he's led us to do so. So I think right now the churches at least the churches as they're in my community, are in a very difficult and confusing spot. Do I have hope? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I keep seeing these inspiring leadership ploys, not just by leading leaders, the ones that are actually running things, but those who are the super servants that are quiet, that aren't known, that are making things happen. And because of that, I've got tremendous hope.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So Dan, I'm going to ask you a question. We're going to stay on this sort of topic of serving people and meeting a need, but okay. I want to know how you would answer this question if you were asked by somebody that you've known for a long time and you trust them as a brother, and you've gotten to do ministry with them, and they say, "Hey, you used to be a runner. We do this thing every August in Oregon. It's really fun. You start at the top of Mount Hood, which is this beautiful place, and you run with a team down to the coast, and you have a big party at the end, and we're going to raise money for South Sudan so that 20,000 kids can have clean water." You know, it's a blast. Dan, what would you say?
I would say, how long do I have to prepare? That's the only question. That's the only question.
About as long as it took him to give you the question.
Yeah, if I got a while, then yeah, for sure. If it's next week, then I think I would do more harm than good.
So what if you said, "Of course, this sounds amazing," and then you find out it's 33 hours in a van. You don't sleep but for about 45 minutes on the first night. You got to run about 17 miles over 3 legs. You're going to slam pretzels and granola bars for all that time. And your last leg is going to be 7.5 miles up a gravel road in the heat of an uncharacteristically hot Oregon summer.
I'm a weirdo, man. All that sounds like a good time as long as I'm ready for it. Like I think all that's cool. Anything active, physical challenge, I'm here for it.
Thank you, Dan.
Steve, you might have a van participant, and Dan Rivera.
Don't think I don't have my email already ready for him right now.
So we got to talk about Hood to Coast, Steve, because despite the way I asked the question to Dan, it has been one of the thrills of my life. And it is this combination of the mother of all relays. It's 199 miles from Mount Hood to Seaside Beach, right? I guess Seaside Beach in Oregon. 2 vans, 6 runners in each, team of 12. You're handing off the baton. You're going to run on average somewhere between probably 14 and 19 miles across 3 legs. You're not going to sleep very much. You're going to smell bad. The conversation in the van is rich. The muscle fatigue is real and painful, but lo and behold, Team World Vision raises about $1 million through 12, 13, 14, 15 teams, something like that every year. I've done it 4 years in a row because you roped me into it. You asked me to do it, but literally one of the thrills of my lifetime. But it is a combination of the physical event and raising this money for one of the most fragile countries on earth. I mean, what an incredible combination. How did this come about for Team World Vision? And more importantly, why are you so passionate about it?
While you were speaking, I was thinking of that great tagline that the Fellowship of Christian Athletes has used for years: inspiration and perspiration. It is an elixir. It is a magic mix. And if it's dialed in correctly, then magic things can often happen, and that they can happen for the kingdom. Clean water in South Sudan, that's a no-brainer. It's one of the youngest nations on the planet. Yeah. The resources in that country, because of the civil war that they had fought before their independence and even after their independence, I mean, everything in South Sudan was broken. And so to be able to provide clean water, I actually was in South Sudan over 20 years ago on a congressional delegation while they were in civil war. The scenes that I saw, the interviews that I had, the people that I related to over the week that I traveled throughout the country, I don't want to even say marked me. I'm going to say scarred me. I walked out of as different from many countries I have been to, and I've been to a lot. I made a covenant to myself. I just said, I got to do something.
Yeah.
I can't just leave here and expect that I'm off the hook. I saw something. I saw brokenness at a level I've never seen before, and desperation I've never seen before. So when I met Lopez Lamong through a mutual friend, at that time he just had carried the U.S. flag at the games in Beijing. It was his first Olympics. He's a Sudanese lost boy who had gotten U.S. citizenship, and I just knew that this might be part of that answer to that prayer that I had made at that time about 13 years prior. So we began to talk. It appeared that World Vision could be a vehicle by which he could fulfill his dream, which was to give back to South Sudan. And the biggest need at that point for us was education and clean water. And so he said, I'll do it. What do you need me to do?
Yeah.
So we cooked up a plan that we would go to this race that has 40,000 people lining up to get inside it. I mean, the waiting list is 40,000 people. And we would talk straight to the leaders of that race. Obviously, the welcoming card was Lopez Lamong was with us.
Yeah.
We come to find out that the leaders of the race love Lopez, have been following his story. He's a Portland guy who's living in Beaverton. So they love that. They love the connection. And so our big scheme was, if we could just get a bunch of everyday runners like you and me and Dan.
You are much more of an everyday runner than I am, my friend.
Well, we're all everyday at some point. Yeah. We all become everyday runners. If we could get a bunch of everyday runners, put them in a van, Lopez would get Olympians to ride with us. And that inspiration, perspiration mix with the understanding that the funds we're raising are for South Sudan, make sure everyone understands the story, what it's about, and then turn people loose. And it has been one of the great thrill rides of my life to watch people like you, others get turned on to it, and then raise an extraordinary amount of money that goes right into clean water for South Sudan. It's been a delight.
Wow.
So cool.
Well, to our Dan, it sounds like you're getting closer and closer to this, man. Like, hey, you got to watch out for that email from Steve Haas. I'm just telling you.
Come on, Dan.
Just give me some time. I'll train for it.
There's like a special magical pixie dust thing that comes out of that email that makes you say yes. It's unreal. So
cool.
But Steve, talk for a second about this last year, because it was a COVID year. We were all remote. We did Hood to Coast remote. The race was canceled. Team World Vision refused to let a year go by without raising money for South Sudan and clean water. And so we ran virtually. We used Slack to tell each other where we were on our leg or that our leg had been completed. This was, I think, the second highest amount of money that Team World Vision has ever raised for South Sudan virtually. How did that happen?
Well, there was a shockwave, obviously, that went through, I think, everybody's planning. It wasn't just hood to coast. It was, I mean, there were people, I think of Lopez himself. He was signed on to defend his 5 and 10,000 meter national championship on the track. Yeah. And of course, the trials went away. The Olympics went away. Conferences that I'm sure many of your listeners were expecting that they were going to attend, or workplaces they were going to go to, went away. Suddenly everything got upended, and Hood to Coast, as a very intense gathering place of a lot of sweaty people sitting inside an incubating van of any number of biological agents that are being created through people just sweating and jumping back in a van. I mean, that went away. And I do believe that there was in some way an audit, a wonderful audit that was made on this particular event when it came to Team World Vision. In other words, why are we doing this? And if it's based on just being together, if it's based on going to Portland and having that experience and going across Oregon and having that experience, then we're done. But the truth of the matter was, I think enough of our folks had understood the importance of what was happening in South Sudan when they showed up. And we realized, well, you don't have to be in Portland for that. We could do that anywhere in the country. And so our team actually had 4 different locations across the United States that we were running, still doing the same mileage, still handing off, using Slack as our way of communicating, still telling stories, but it was over the phone or over the internet.
That's right.
So all of that was still continuing. But the biggest thing was we were still on task to raise funding for South Sudan.
Yeah.
And I really believe God loves that kind of stuff, because I think we kept the main thing the main thing. And again, the fact that we had over $1 million, I think, simply underlined that for most of us.
Wow.
So what's next for Steve Haas? How can our listeners find you or follow you on social media and all that?
A great question. I think stay tuned. I've always been one to keep a really, really low profile so you don't see me with a large social footprint. I guess I could. I don't know where. I don't know how some of you guys have the time to do it, because I see you so busy in these other things. So I aspire to be able to do this. I don't think you sleep, I think is what the story is. But for me, I think right now I'm having some very, very dedicated conversations with folks who are really concerned about the U.S. church. The toxicity level is at a level that is unsustainable.
Yeah.
It's doing tremendous damage to the body of Christ and how we're viewed globally and how we're viewed nationally. And so I'm having some, even though I'm supposed to be kind of early retirement, I mean, that was the leaving World Vision. That was the terminology they used. I think everybody knew, no, he's just leaving World Vision to go do something else. That new thing, I think, will be rather creative, much like my time at World Vision was creative.
Yeah.
And one of the main pieces will be the health of the U.S. church. So stay tuned there. We'll be back to you with how that will look. But the conversations I'm having with national leaders on that scale has been very eye-opening. I can say that.
Very cool.
That is very cool and very needed. Steve, I'm going to ask you to leave our listeners with a little bit of Steve Haas wisdom. So we've seen how you were impacted in middle school by your dad's conversion to faith. Your faithfulness and commitment to your walk as you were a NCAA athlete, cross-country team for the University of Kansas. And for all of the time in your life, certainly for the last 6 years that I've known you, you have not stopped proclaiming the message of the gospel when it comes to serving those in need. The marginalized, the poor, the victimized, the oppressed, the the sufferers of injustice, whatever it might be, you are 24/7, 365 committed to your walk with Christ and serving those in need. The picture that we've given as the catalyst for this podcast, and I think I've mentioned to everybody at everybody who's been from World Vision on this podcast, you, Marianne, Dr. Norman, et cetera, that Dan and I going to Ethiopia was one of the catalysts for this podcast. And we really dove into the parable of Luke chapter 10 and what it means to be a good neighbor and a good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan term has become a bit secularized, and that's okay because it comes from a very good place. But it was intended to tell people a few things. One is you can't ignore the person on the other side of the road. You need to go walk across the road and take care of that individual that's been left behind, beaten, robbed, left for dead. You can't let your spiritual boundaries prevent you from getting involved. And you know what? It's probably really good if the person on the other side of the road is different from you. So can you help us in a way that only Steve Haas can? Can you get our listeners on a path of being better Good Samaritans because of the wisdom of Steve Haas than they were before this podcast?
I'm humbled by the question because I see so many shortcomings that I'm still trying to address, given the level of blessing that I've been given and the responsibility that I feel on a regular basis as to what to do with that. I'm the most blessed guy. I've been given resources and relationships and environments. They're the envy of the world. And I don't think I have a conception of God. I used to, a conception of God that therefore you got to work. You got to work it out. You got to go do stuff. I gave you a lot of stuff and I'm expecting an accounting. I don't think God operates that way. I think God gave me that stuff because he was thrilled to watch me utilize it for the good of others. And so it's kind of with bated breath. Watch this, watch what he's going to do. Watch what he's going to do. Here we go. Yeah. Watch what happens. Now let me refill that. And as I've had the great blessing of being able to utilize these resources and gifts, God keeps filling it up. He keeps doing it again. Not to say that there's not difficulty or challenges or pain or suffering or loss. All that's true. That's life.
Yeah.
But in the midst of it, God has always been one that just seems to love filling this one back up. And I would say for me in this day and age, I'm at another flex point of which I think all of us are in to some degree of really making some decisions. Is this going to be about insularity? Is this going to be about, mine and only mine and take care of myself? I mean, I hear all this stuff about COVID. COVID is one of those elements, very real, that can make you very quickly just think about what's behind the mask.
Yeah.
And that's it. And yet, my gosh, I got neighbors that are broken. I've got a community that's broken. And to what extent is this actually an engagement opportunity for me to just ask some simple questions? For me, that's kind of where it starts, is just asking questions and then following the lead to where the answers are. So again, I think we in our own country, we're, for the first time in a long time, many of us are feeling what other people in the world feel when it comes to this sense that I can't get my way out of this. Yeah. I can't factor my way out. I don't have the financial or the mental resources to stop something I cannot see. That's most of the people that I visited with World Vision internationally that we were dealing with that were objects of our compassion. And that of many of your listeners, that was the issue, is they just felt like they were in a part of a train that was running away and uncontrollable. And I think if there's anything I learned from them was, I serve one who does know. I serve one who does understand. I serve one who, in fact, has conquered this to such an extent that he's calling me outside myself.
Yeah.
I can trust him. He's good. He will follow through. He will lead well. And my job is to follow him. And so what's my biggest task right now? Abide. Abide. What is he telling me today? Who is he telling me to touch today? Who am I supposed to listen to today? And then to be good about that, to follow that, and to following that prompt, recognizing that I'm in the train of effectiveness for the kingdom, because I'm just faithful to him.
Very good. That's so good. I would summarize that as we had this conversation that Christianity is a faith, is a belief, and it's a worldview, right? It's kind of all those things about them. It's not about us. It's you can't look at yourself and say, what do I get out of this? You just can't. It's an about them. And what I love about your story, Steve, and what I love about what you just told our listeners is, look, just pour out your cup to them, and God will fill it back up. And you will be replenished and energized and committed in a way that you never have been before. And I hope our listeners know, because I keep saying it and you've lived it authentically, that is what the life of Steve Haas has been about. And it's been just such a pleasure to be alongside you for the time that I have, to see you living out this pouring out of the cup and watching it get filled back up, and pouring out of the cup and watching it get filled back up again. It's a beautiful picture of faith.
Well, if that's the demonstration you've seen, praise God. I'm also aware of just the many stumbles. I remember a saying that I saw, literally as I was preaching. There was a saying written on the back door of the church. It said, "The worship is over, the service begins." And I thought, oh my gosh, that's it, isn't it? These private times of worship that happen throughout the day, as I just connect up, I ping back and forth to God. And am I doing it? Is this what you want me to do? Is this what I'm supposed to say? Am I supposed to speak, or am I supposed to be quiet? As I do that, hopefully more and more reflexively, man, it's out into the world. It's out into the world.
Yeah.
And that is where the joy comes from, not out of guilt, not out of shame, but out of an increasing exuberance that I get to be counted one of his. It's pretty powerful. It's a pretty powerful life to be able to live.
Yeah. Well, you please give our giving company best to your lovely wife, Seville, and tell Beej that if Dan and I ever wind up in a van again, we need his cell phone number so that he can fill in for us on one of those legs when we're really in pain.
You're not supposed to talk about that. You're not supposed to talk about that.
Never mind. We'll edit that out, Dan. Anyway, Steve, it has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for joining us on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thank you, man.
Please keep us posted on the next step of your journey, because I know it's going to be a blast to watch, and I know it's going to have a huge impact on the kingdom all around the world.
That it might be with you as well. I mean, I thank you. You are a brother for the ages. So thoroughly enjoy you.
Thanks, man.
Well, to all of our listeners, it has been a pleasure talking with Steve Haas, a catalyst, as only he can be a catalyst. That's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. This is David Hendrickson with my co-host,
Dan Riveros.
We'll talk to you next time. Thanks so much for tuning in.
See you guys. For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.